when Thomas More wrote his book Utopia, he wrote it in Latin because, and this is only a relatively short time ago in bourgeois time, in that century the very idea of a just or equal or let alone an ideal society was quite literally not for the profane, not even for those of the profane or vulgar who could read. And that's been the situation with schemes for the ideal or the fair or the just society for the greater part of human history. And that's why, I can say this now, Dinesh D'Souza and I are paradoxically bonded together by at least one thing in common, in that we are respectively defenders of capitalism and socialism. These two systems are the only claimants that human genius has so far evolved to a modernist and a universalizing ethic and practice. We both make large claims for ourselves and for our favorite systems and systems of ideas. And as Dinesh, I think, might be the first to admit, no, might be the last to admit, but would have to admit at any event, Karl Marx was the first writer on society and on political economy to get capitalism's point, to see what distinguished it from pre-existing forms of accumulation, modes of production, and so forth, and to heap really almost embarrassing praise upon it, especially when he was writing in concert with Engels in the Manifesto, but later in the Grundrisse and in the Gotha program and in all 3 volumes of Capital, he praised it as an unprecedented system for dissolving the bonds of slavery and contract and indenture, a system of wealth and of science and of innovation above all. Of course, he pointed out that it could coexist with and could even at times necessitate forms of slavery of its own, forms of imperialism, and forms obviously of war, perhaps war above all, and coercion. Nonetheless, he did pay it this tremendous dialectical, paradoxical compliment, which no one since him has sought to rescind. It certainly wouldn't be me. But he did not think it was history's last word, to coin a current vulgarism. And though he paid it more eloquent compliments than Milton Friedman was ever able to do, has ever been able to do, I'll stress this because it'll be the last bit of common ground between D'Souza and myself. I didn't come here as a healer, and I don't regard myself as one. But if we look at what the critique, the original socialist critique of capitalism actually was, and think of what the key words were that it contributed to the vernacular and the idiom of political economy, ways of thinking about society and humanity, I think you might be more impressed than you thought you were going to be. Think of how you could carry on a modern discussion without saying and meaning to say the word exploitation, the word class, the word alienation, the word contradiction, or without having some idea of what the difference was between use value and exchange value, or without knowing somewhere in you and in your brain that there was a difference between the forces and the relations of production. That's to say that to refer to the economy is puerile, because it's simply to aggregate and to lump together various categories that deserve to be distinguished. Imagine, in other words, a discourse that didn't possess such a terminology, and think what Stephen Hawking is only the most recent, not of the materialist conception of history, but of the materialist conception of nature itself and of the universe and the cosmos, something of which Marx, who had an appointment to meet Darwin, which Darwin did not keep, for which I can't be responsible, wasn't able to do any more than guess at, but nonetheless, at all points of indication of the materialist conception upon which the study of capital is based, and is based by those who wish to defend and uphold it, just as much as by those who wish to transcend and replace and improve upon it, to say nothing of those of us who wish it to be overthrown. Now, admittedly, Dinesh, I don't want to misrepresent him, doesn't come before us essentially as a modernist. His faction of the conservative movement, in fact, is charming and repays study because it still retains within itself various pre-capitalist, almost feudal formations, certainly pre-modern ones, that have been, as it were, transmitted on through the transmutation of these systems, such as the idea of the strong nation-state, a nation-state that can be an individual actor, that can actually be masculine and stand tall and things of its kind, each with its own surplus, incidentally, though it's never been satisfactorily established by the partisans of capitalism how each free enterprise nation-state come out ahead of the game in the terms of trade and everyone have a surplus. Nonetheless, the idea exists, such as the idea, which he also espouses, that God created man rather than the other way around, such as the idea that morality in society and in the individual derives from religion and from the supernatural, and such as the idea that a ruling class can embody an idea such as liberty in a crusade against evil, another idea. These are all ideas that, as he knows, were stale when Galileo was young, but still are important to the defenders of a system that should really be advancing itself as the culmination of modernism, and yet doesn't quite have that self-confidence. And I find that want of self-confidence intriguing and want to pursue it. I'll give him credit, though, for one confusion that could only have emerged in our own time, a confusion that you could only get in the 20th century, which is that capitalism and free enterprise are in some sense the same thing, how they must wish it was so. Now, I've kept being told all this week that I'll be on the defensive this evening, because after all, you only have to open a daily newspaper to find that socialism is a thing of the past. But I don't really see why I should be on the defensive in the least. For Mr. D'Souza to carry his point, the proposition that's contained in the matter for debate this evening, he has to argue that capitalism has put itself beyond the reach of the socialist critique, that there's simply no point any longer in any of the words I mentioned earlier, any of the terminology I emphasized before, any of the historic critique of the system that's been so painfully evolved. It has to show that capitalism doesn't need that any longer, is proof against this critique. I would rather be in my position than in his, which is why I'm not going to be defensive. The culmination of human endeavor, in my opinion, has not yet occurred. The future has not yet taken place. Everything is still to play for. What we as socialists have said about the way we live now and the mode of life bequeathed to us by the capitalist system has not lost its relevance. Of course, we on the left have been here before. We've been told before that we have nothing new to contribute, that our ideas are obsolete and redundant. We've been at our own funerals more often than Tom Sawyer. When Capital was first published, von Mises and von Baerwerk and others of the early Vienna school published a long thing. It was published in the 1890s called Karl Marx and the Close of His System, saying there's no need to read this book at all. I think that's premature. It was said just before the First World War by Kautsky and others attacking Luxembourg and Liebknecht and Franz Mehring that there was no further relevance in the socialist critique of empire and war. That was said in 1913, late 1913, and that the whole idea of monopoly capitalism, imperialism and so on was a redundant propagandistic concept. Who ate their words on that occasion? Throughout the 1930s it was said that fascism had done for capitalism what socialism had claimed to do instead, that it had solved the problem of distribution, of unemployment and so on. National Socialism in combination with capitalism was the regnant system in Eastern and Central Europe at that time, tried to extend itself in both directions with consequences which are still, I think, quite well remembered. My comment on that would be, and on National Socialism and in its fascist form, that nobody tries to counterfeit a bankrupt currency, that there are some compliments that we've been paid by our enemies, even as they try to say there is no further need for our socialist critique any longer. And it was just after they finished murdering the Spanish Republic that the British Foreign Office announcing between Munich and the Hitler-Stalin Pact, with the smirk of complacency not, I think, since duplicated till Mr. Fukuyama's recent essay. That point announced, with all the refulgence of the Foreign Office critique of the modern world, they said all the isms are now wasn't. And that was said in 1939. So if I seem a little world-weary, ladies and gentlemen, comrades and friends, you'll understand why that has to be. This leaves, I mean, it makes it pretty OTOs to mention the 1950s and Daniel Bell saying that ideology would end and that Encounter magazine would replace it. As Marx used to say, substituting the government of men for the administration of things. Just before the three great movements on which many of us got our teeth, one against an unjust and criminal war in Indochina, one for the allotment of human status to black Americans, and one for the admission of the idea of women as a social category, the three great movements that have changed our world, in all of which socialists played a leading part and still do. That was what happened immediately after the end of ideology had been proclaimed by Mr. Bell and his opinion. I don't mean to be cheap by saying that I didn't see Mr. D'Souza and his friends involved in any of these three great movements, but without being fresh about it, I think I can say that having survived all the things I've just described, we will also survive the Reagan-Bush years, and we'll do so almost as with a vacation spirit. Now, if I can be vulgar and empirical for a second more, and this is distinctly vulgar and empirical, but I don't think it's avoidable. What about, ladies and gentlemen, what about the evidence of your senses? Because after all, the materialist conception applies to the cosmos as well as to the argument about physical economy. I don't honestly believe that if you look around you at the empty and manipulated politics and the huckster and phony religion and the daily insult of your mass media, or television or newspapers, and your fellow citizens eating pet food and sleeping in the doorways of banks, dreading a hard winter as people haven't had to do in a developed country since before the Industrial Revolution, actually having to live by the rhythms of nature in a pre-capitalist sense, and care about the climate as a matter of political economy before your eyes. And did you read the report of how many children in the most prosperous country in the world live below the poverty line? And did you read how generously the poverty line is defined before that research began? I don't believe if you look at the evidence of your senses, and I'm not asking for you to trust the evidence of your emotions, and I'd like to make that distinction. The evidence of your senses and your reasoning, and the contrast between what is happening and what you know humanity with its resources and innovation is capable of delivering, if you look at that, which is the central, and I borrow another word from myself and my predecessors, contradiction of the system and its potential, I don't believe you're going to say, this is the best we can do. And yet you're all encouraged to think of yourselves, are you not, as proud, individual, autonomous, heroic consumers with rights. And can't you just hear the laughter as they think of you? They've got you more or less taped, I think. You've all been, in fact, collectivized. You live under a system that exhibits some of the worst features of what you're warned would happen if there was socialism, the collectivization of the psyche and of human effort. You've all been collectivized in a sense, don't just mean by the spin doctors and by the market researchers and the professional politicians, but for example, though there's that too, and it isn't to be despised, but by the planners of a nuclear economy. And while you sleep and while you play and while you heroically consume and while you congratulate yourself on being heroic autonomous individuals and consumers with rights, your constitution is being torn apart by thugs whose names you're not allowed to know. Your foreign policy franchised to private entrepreneurs whose names you're not allowed to know either, and mercenaries, and fat cats, and crooks. And you get up to things in El Salvador and in South Africa and in Nicaragua and elsewhere in your name that, according to the opinion polls, at any rate, you don't even want to know about, and perhaps don't. Now, for shame for all that. Is anyone going to say that that's the best we can do, that this is the end of history, that this is the summa of human endeavor? I don't believe it. I don't think that's the way you would wish, if this was a motion for debate, to cast your vote. And then you've all been collectivized, I think, in another way, a very sinister way. Socialists are against statism and collectivism, as you know. The Bourgeois Revolution, which was a tremendous revolution, the 200th anniversary of which we're celebrating this year, set out to abolish the power of life and death as exerted arbitrarily by the state and the monarch and the divine right of the ruling class. It was the signal achievement of the Bourgeois Revolution, which led to the industrial and capitalist revolutions, to challenge that and say, no, you don't have the right of life and death over the citizen. You don't have what feudalism called, that couldn't call itself feudalism, because it didn't have enough self-consciousness, the justice of the high, the middle, and the low, where these powers are arrogated to the lords and powers spiritual and temporal. Now, we've actually relapsed from that as history has progressed. Everyone in this room today is in effect in a uniform and also has been placed in a front-line trench. The nuclear state, the thermonuclear state, the plutonium state, under which we actually live, but for which we cannot vote, and in whose consuming and producing affairs we have no say and no role, has arrogated to itself the power of life and death over all of us, all day and all night, and now for many years. Has also denied us the right to make inquiry about it. And we're really never, any of us, more than quite a few minutes away, in spite of some fine-tuning done recently by the arms control professional, never very far from the moment when it could well be that, as the great philosopher of the subject said, the living might envy the dead, and those of us who were among the living might find ourselves praying, in many cases for the first time, to die. Now, who is going to say that the system I've just sketched, I have only time to sketch it in? And those contradictions and contrasts that are permanent and deeply inscribed in it, who's going to say that that system has put itself beyond the reach, beyond the need for the humanist, rationalist, socialist critique? I don't believe any honest person thinks that it's put itself anywhere near the point where it could claim to be immune from these processes. I think it's mere complacency and solipsism for its defenders to say so. I think in doing so they deceive themselves and attempt to deceive you. Still, the system has its defenders, the system of state monopoly capitalism, coupled with the war economy, which is the main engine of its prosperity in the post-slump period, has its defenders, and they deserve their honor, in my opinion, because it may be asking too much of capital to solve all its contradictions. But if it isn't the same as free enterprise, because you can have free enterprise under any system, because of the human tendency to wish to accumulate, and if you can't have free enterprise under capitalism because of capitalism's renowned tendency to monopoly and to dependency upon the state, that's to say the identity of it with free enterprise and entrepreneurship is propaganda only, because capital is monopoly, capital is partnership with statism and collectivism, as in Japan, as in Taiwan, as in Singapore, as in Hong Kong, as in all the instances given by Mr. D'Souza, the success stories of what are in fact programmed economies, grown up under the American war economy umbrella, parasitic upon it, entirely dependent on the collusion of state and monopoly. Now, nor is it, therefore, so capitalism isn't that, whatever its defenders may say. It's not free enterprise and entrepreneurship and the unleashed human will. Nor is it the correspondence in political economy to human nature, which is what people like Friedman and to some extent von Hayek have argued for it. Because if that were so, why has it only evolved in a very few societies in the last century and a half? Why has it simply failed to establish itself as a system anytime, anywhere before the 19th century, and since the 19th century only in a few countries, and in most of those countries in a maimed and calamitous and catastrophic form, such as in pre-revolution Russia and China, where the only form of capital accumulation available after the complete collapse of the capitalist system was forced accumulation by means of socialist and dirigist planning. These are questions that Mr. D'Souza doesn't even seem to think are interesting, because if capitalism is human nature, there's nothing really to argue about, is there? There would be really almost nothing for us to discuss. I think we can, however, we can prove by indirection, by intuition, whatever it is, it isn't simply the conformity of human nature to political economy. So what is it? It's a system really that emerges from the coincidence between the Industrial Revolution and modern imperialism. Now, I just want to ask, because I don't want to overrun my time, whether that system, born out of the Industrial Revolution and its coincidence with empire, which is what we talk about in real historic time, whether it has outlived any of the 5 or 6 keywords I cited at the start, and I'll be as cryptic as I can without I hope, being vulgar. Exploitation, for example. Exploitation is not a moral term, though it's quite useful in moral discourse. It simply means the rate at which people are deprived of the due that is theirs for their labor, for the investment of the only thing they've got, in the case of most human beings, their ability to work and work for others. Now, I'll give just one example. It was cited by the World Bank earlier this year that the total of all foreign aid given to just the Latin American continent in the last 5 years was approximately 1/20th. The total of all foreign aid was 1/20th of what those same Latin American countries had to repay to Western banks in the form not of debt repaid, but of the servicing of the interest on those debts. That is a good working definition. I'd be willing to be challenged upon it, of what is meant by the process of exploitation. It's not a moral point. It's a point about how you're prepared to live with your fellow citizens in other countries and fellow humans, fellow creatures in other countries, certainly. It has moral to that extent, but it's also an index of the rate at which people are deprived of what is due to them for their ability to work for others. Class. Another key word I mentioned. Well, everyone in America appears to know what class they're not in. And some say that it's by denying that they have a class system that the thing keeps limping on at all. But everyone usually has some idea of what the class above and immediately below them is, and certainly recently there's been an idea that there might be such a thing as an underclass, which you can't have if you don't have any other kind of class, it seems, at any rate to me, and which has a certain marginal utility for politics, in that if you create an underclass, as Reagan and Bush did, and make it larger, you can then run against it, because what you've created is quite frightening. And having, as it were, invented Mr. Horton, you can also recycle him. This is, I think, a condemnation of the politics as well as the economics of the class system, and also brings one to a second word, which is often misused too, which is that of alienation. How do you actually want to live with your fellow humans? I mean, what sort of relationship with them do you want to have? Do you simply want to say, well, you take your chances and I'll take mine, and we'll all meet at infinity, which is roughly the mandate that's being proposed to you? I don't think so. The market isn't actually going to take care of that to infinity. You'll meet these people again down the road and wish you'd thought about them the first time. That's our point about the 60s. That's the price of giving up the war on poverty the last time round. We're paying that price now because people weren't prepared to think as socialists about their fellows and think of what proportion of the social product might be used in which ways. Everyone instead in their own cave, atomized, anomic, pretending to be individual, autonomous, and at liberty, and being really nothing of the kind. And when we think of all the literature on this and the lonely crowd and the rest of it, we realize we've been collectivized and atomized at the same time and in the same way. I don't think we can say that the word alienation is a word that capitalism has managed to outlive either. As for use value and exchange value, anyone who's looked at that distinction as made in the original critique and has then looked at what's been happening to the American economy in the last few years with an enormous process of making money and producing nothing, an enormous redistribution of paper resources from poor to rich, a gigantic accumulation of non-wealth from non-production for falsely conceived goals, will not treat with contempt the idea that use value and exchange value are nonsense categories, or categories that capitalism has learned to do without or has transcended. These are important to understanding the way we live now. The conflict between the forces and relations of production, which is the center of the socialist critique, actually is best applied at the moment, I think, to the state-ified economies of Eastern Europe, on which D'Souza spent some time, because there it's become self-evident that the materialist critique is correct, that there is a conflict between the relations of production, the party state, and the nationalization of the contradictions, the statifying of the contradiction, and the possible development of the actual productive resources in concert with others. And it is that conflict between the forces and relations of production that has led to the greatest political change in the post-war period. It is that, not the mercenaries of the CIA blowing up bridges, nor the pointing of plutonium weapons at Warsaw and Budapest and Moscow and Vladivostok. It is that process, the working out of the conflict between forces and relations of production, that has borne in upon those states themselves that one of them has got to go. And that is, you might think of being paradoxical or wry, but that is a vindication of the materialist conception of history. I can see I'm about to get past a note, and I won't detain you any longer than to say that though capitalism's had a longer lease of life than some of us would have predicted, or that many of our ancestors in the socialist movement did predict or allow, it still produces the fax machine and the microchip, and is still able to lower its cost, and still able to flatten its distribution curve very well. Its central contradiction remains the same. It produces publicly, it produces socially. It conscripts and it mobilizes and educates whole new workforces of people. It has an enormous transforming, liberating effect in that respect, but it appropriates privately. The resources and the natural abilities are held in common. The earth belongs to us all. You can't buy your child a place at a school with better ozone. You can't pretend that the world is other than what it is, which is one and human and natural and in common. But capitalism must do that because it must make us all work until the point when the social product is to be shared, when suddenly the appropriation is private and suddenly Donald Trump outvotes any congressman you can name and anyone with a vote because of the ownership of capital. And it's that effect, that annexation of what we all do and must do, the influence of labor and intelligence and creativity on nature, the same air, the same water that we must breathe and drink, that means that we may not have long in which to make this critique of the system sing again, and relevant again, and incisive again. And in doing that, I'm afraid, I'll have to quarrel with Dinesh D'Souza that we already live in more or less the best of all possible worlds. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Hitchens.